Welcome everyone to the Faculty Lunchtime Presentation Series for the University Research Center. We're delighted to have you here, and I'm delighted to introduce my colleague. Nichole Sanders earned her BA in History from the University of Texas at Austin and her PhD in Latin American History from the University of California, Irvine. Her research focuses on gender and sexuality in modern Mexico. Her first monograph, Gender and Welfare in Mexico, the Consolidation of a Post-Revolutionary State, 1937 to 1958, was published by Penn State University Press in 2011. She also published a co-edited volume called Maternalism Reconsidered, Motherhood, Welfare, and Social Policy in the 20th Century with Bergen Books in 2012. More recently, she co-edited a special volume in the journal Mexican Studies on the history of sexuality in 20th century Mexico City. She has published multiple peer-reviewed articles and book chapters, winning the Latin American Studies Association Mexico section's Best Humanities Essay Award for her article, Gender and Consumption in Porfirian Mexico, Images of Women in Advertising, El Imparcial, 1897 to 1910, in 2018. She also won University of Lynchburg's James A. Houston Award for Excellence in Scholarship in 2013. She is currently working on a second project that will explore debates about women and consumption during the Mexican Miracle. She has been our colleague in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences since 2003, I think. My name is Dr. Robin Bates. I am one of the fellows in the University Research Center, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Nichole Sanders.
Thank you all so much for coming out this afternoon. I was really expecting it to be just me and Robin. Let's just have a conversation. But this is great. This is really part of a project that I've been working on for a while, and some of the research that I'm presenting has been stuff that I've been working on for 20 years now. So I was also talking to Robin and Tom. The last time I gave a version of this presentation, I did it in Mexico, in Spanish, to an audience of women's historians. And now I'm giving it to an audience in English who don't know anything, many of you, about Mexico. So it's really quite a different presentation. I'm going to be giving some background information, but feel free to stop me and ask questions if something doesn't make sense. So the first question I usually get is, I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, and so people are like, how on earth did you get interested in Mexican history? That's not something that's very usual for somebody from Baltimore. And the answer is, I took Spanish all through high school, and I wound up going on a student exchange trip through the Rotary Club. And I did a summer in Mexico, became very good friends with a woman in Mexico City who stayed with me for a month, and then I went back and visited her over Christmas break a couple years later. And as we were there, we're driving around Mexico City, and there are huge billboards with a man's face and a political party, the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, written all over it. And so I asked, I'm like, what are those billboards about? And they're like, oh, that's our next president. His name is Carlos Salinas, and he is going to be the president. He's going to be our next president. He represents the PRI, which is the Partido Revolucionario Institucional. And I was like, oh, fantastic, that's great. When were the elections? Oh, the elections aren't going to be until July. And I was like, well, how then do you know that he's going to be your next president? And that sort of got me down the rabbit hole of how the PRI has had, up until that point, consolidated power in Mexico for, they finally lost power in the year 2000, but for 70 years. So how did this one political party hold elections every year and maintain political power in a country that was presumably a democracy? And for somebody, this is in the 1980s, that'll date me a little bit. I had always sort of understood government to be either democracy or communism. And so it really kind of blew my mind about how you could have a democracy that didn't really function like a democracy. And so I became very interested in how the PRI maintained power and how it was able to do this. The short answer, of course, is corruption, right? There is a lot of corruption in Mexico. There continues to be a lot of corruption in Mexico. Another short answer is violence, right? They control the military, they control the police forces. But you can't really rule a country for over 70 years with violence and corruption. There had to be other ways that the PRI was maintaining its power over this really long period of time. So when I got to grad school, I became really interested in questions of citizenship. So how does the PRI maintain power, particularly when it's disenfranchised huge swaths of its population, particularly women? So women do not get the vote in Mexico until 1953. So how does the PRI maintain power when half of its population can't vote? And how do women understand citizenship when they also don't have the vote? We tend to define citizenship very narrowly as your ability to vote in an election. How did Mexican women then understand citizenship when they couldn't participate politically through suffrage? So that is what I began to study through my dissertation and first book. And so what I'm going to do is give a little bit of background into what's going on in Mexico in the 20th century, just so you guys have some context for what I'm talking about. So Mexico had been ruled by a dictator named Porfirio Diaz until roughly 1910. In 1910, through a variety of reasons, Porfirio Diaz loses power and Mexico plunges into a revolution. So there's a violent, wide-scale revolution in Mexico from 1910 to roughly 1917. In 1917, one of the factions kind of consolidates power and writes a constitution. So this is the Constitution of 1917. There's a constitutional convention, there are a bunch of different factions, but they all finally agree on, it's like 150 articles long. But for our purposes, the ones that are important are Article 3, Article 130, and Article 35. So Article 35, actually Article 34 as well, are really interesting. These are the articles that restrict women from the vote. And it becomes a bone of contention because basically what it says is todos los mexicanos have the right to vote. So when I talk to students about this, I'm like, there's a grammatical thing happening here. Todos los mexicanos in Spanish can be all Mexicans, men and women, or it can also mean all Mexicans, just men. And so women are like, this is fabulous. We all have the vote now. And the representatives to the Constitutional Convention are like, oh, no. We really just meant men with this one. And so women are restricted from the vote. And largely, and this will become important later, they're restricted because this is a very anti-clerical document, which I'll talk about in a minute. And the men writing this document believe that women shouldn't have the right to vote because women, according to them, are very religious. And if they have the right to vote, then it's going to be Catholic priests telling them who to vote for. And therefore, the Catholic Church is going to have disproportionate power in Mexican politics. So as I mentioned, this constitution continues a pattern of anti-clericalism in Mexico that started well back in the 19th century. But this is a particularly sharp criticism of the Catholic Church. So Article 3 basically creates a secular education system, but limits the ability of the Catholic Church to provide education. So everybody has to get, it mandates primary education for everyone, but it has to be through a state school. You can no longer be educated officially in a Catholic school. And Article 130 does a bunch of different things that really limits the power of the Catholic Church, but kind of in an extreme way. So it says things like Catholic priests can't vote in Mexico. Catholic priests can't wear clerics in the street. Catholic priests have to be born Mexican. Catholic priests can't associate, so you can't have a group of priests together talking. So these are very sort of restrictive laws that are passed, largely because of this history of anti-clericalism and designed to limit the power of the Catholic Church in Mexico. These are not really enforced until about 1926, when President Calles takes over, and he himself is very, very anti-clerical. So he begins enforcing these laws. And the result of this is that many Catholics in Mexico rise up, and we have the Cristera Rebellion. So there's a huge, massive, violent rebellion, Catholics versus the state, that is finally, there's a negotiated settlement in 1929. And I'll go back and talk about what that negotiated settlement looks like in a little bit. So the Cristera Rebellion has been settled, but the government continues to distrust the Catholic Church. In 1934, Lázaro Cárdenas becomes president, and he launches a socialist education project. So from 1934 to 1940, everybody has to go through this socialist education. And part of socialist education is designed to, they say it's designed to combat fanaticism. So it's really about making sure the Catholic Church has no control over education. But they also do things like launch a mandatory sexual education program, which I'll explain why in a minute. So as you can imagine, between the two, Catholics are very, very upset, continue to be upset through the 1930s with the Mexican government. In 1940, we have a new administration. Avila Camacho is the new president, and he basically comes into office and says, "Soy creyente," which in Spanish means I am a believer. And so with that goes the history books. Was that the whole conflict between the church and the state was solved because Avila Camacho said "Soy creyente." So what I want to talk about a little bit is what "Soy creyente" means and why, while it is a pivotal moment in Mexican history, why it's a little bit more complicated than that. So, any questions so far?
Actually, I have a quick question.
Yes.
Anti-clerical, so just against the Catholic Church or against other religions like Methodism?
Against the Catholic Church hierarchy.
Okay.
Okay, so socialist education was part and parcel of this new trend in Mexico, where people began to believe, or reformers began to believe in the power of scientific motherhood. So scientific motherhood was a desire to quote unquote improve the race in order to economically progress and become a developed nation. So Mexican government officials, Mexican reformers, so these are like social workers, nurses, teachers, believed very much that in order for Mexico to become modern, like the United States or like Europe, they needed to improve the race. And so they set about creating programs designed to mejorar la raza. So this may sound familiar to you guys. It certainly should sound familiar to Brian. This is a program steeped in the science of eugenics, right? So puericultura is the science of child rearing, and this is part and parcel of the way eugenics is understood in Mexico. So this is actually a picture of a journal called Puericultura that you could read to learn how to scientifically raise your children. It's also targeted towards social workers so that they can learn how to help mothers scientifically raise their children. And it says curiosidad at the bottom, so the little child is curious, and this is a good thing. So just a little bit about eugenics in Mexico. Eugenics in Mexico can be seen as part of, as I said, post-revolutionary state building. Mexican eugenics emphasize the importance of motherhood, sexuality, and children to the national project of modernization. So echoing French eugenicists, Mexicans embraced puericultura, the scientific cultivation of the child, and advocated a pronatalism tempered by biological selection. Reformers believed that syphilis, alcoholism, and diseases such as tuberculosis had direct hereditary effects. And so this is a little bit different of an understanding of eugenics than what we had in the United States or in Nazi Germany. So the French and then in Latin America believed that vices, as they called it, basically directly, they called it the germplasm, we would call it your DNA, that your vices would directly alter your germplasm, and then you would give birth to children who are racially inferior. So you can see why mothers are super important. You want to keep mothers healthy in order to keep their germplasm healthy so that they can give birth to strong, racially superior children. So therefore, in order to recreate a new healthy population, eugenists believe that educational measures such as puericulture classes and other public health programs were essential for Mexico to progress and modernize. Eugenics, understood at this time as a science, was promoted as a progressive and modern way for Mexico to develop. In order to modernize, policymakers maintained that Mexican industries needed vigorous, healthy workers, and in order to raise children to become these modern workers, mothers had to be trained to raise their children in appropriate ways. Mothers also had to be taught to avoid vice and disease so that they could not pass these diseases to their children genetically. Eugenics offered Mexican and other Latin American elites a quote-unquote scientific way to reshape their populations and redefine citizenship along specific gender and racial norms. And I'll show you a picture in a minute. Eugenics focused on reproduction and socialization, thereby increasing the importance of mothers and children to rapidly modernizing societies. As historian Alexander Minastern points out, quote, "This historical transformation entailed more than just a reinscription of a traditional patriarchal view of women as caretakers. At stake was the rearticulation of all points of power within the domestic domain. Only such intimate contact could construct modern citizens and recompose existing ones," unquote. The changes in Mexico and Latin America reflected a global movement towards the reform of gender relations in interwar years. Eugenics rewrote power within the family, giving the mother a vital role to play in the construction of modern nation states. The centrality of motherhood challenged the ultimate patriarchal authority of the father within the family, but it did not fundamentally challenge patriarchy as a social construct, since male power within the family was transferred to the state, embodied by the predominantly male medical establishment and the government. So their argument was that mothers were central to the modernization project, both through their physical health and through the way they raised their children as well. And so they established several agencies designed to help mothers raise their children. One was the Secretaría de Educación Pública, which is the Ministry of Public Education, which socialist education was run through. And then they also established the Ministry of Public Assistance. And so my first book is about the programs of the Ministry of Public Assistance. So how did they use social welfare policy to construct, to run these classes, to run these programs in order to construct motherhood in a particular way. This is really about, I argue, the modernization of patriarchy. And so they're not arguing that men should not have power within the family. What they're attempting to do is rewrite fathers' roles within the family. Many of these middle-class reformers believe that poor men in particular were vice-ridden, alcoholics, they were gamblers, they liked to go to cockfights. And so their view was, if we can rein them in and make them be better human beings, then they can support the mothers and we can have these really fabulous families that will modernize Mexico. So, and if fathers are absent, if they've abandoned their role, if they've abandoned their responsibility, then the state can step in through these welfare programs and through these educational programs to sort of serve as the father to these Mexican families. So they created a number in Mexico City of maternal child centers, basically. This is a publication from the General Maximino Avila Camacho Maternal Child Center. But you can see it doesn't look super modern to us, but in 1946, when it was established, it was like the best, most modern. It had hospital facilities. People could bring their children in for vaccinations, to see doctors. Women and mothers could take classes on how to be better mothers. There were nutrition classes. There were all sorts of classes and programs designed to kind of rewrite the family and to center mothers as the most important part of this family. And so, as I mentioned, this is really about improving the race, and they have a very specific view of what people should look like. So this is the cover of a magazine from the Anti-Tuberculosis Society, privileging motherhood, but in a very particular way, right? Like, very few Mexicans look like this. And it's not that there aren't blonde Mexicans, because there are, but promoting a vision of a very white mother and child as the ideal for Mexican mothers, Mexican families, is part and parcel of this idea of improving the race, right? So we have that going on through socialist education. Again, sex education is designed to teach people basically how not to get syphilis. So, syphilis was a huge concern in Mexico in the 20s and the 30s because men were going to prostitutes, they were getting syphilis, so the reformers would say. Men are getting syphilis, they're going to prostitutes, they're bringing syphilis home to their wives, the wives are then have syphilis and give birth to children who are racially inferior. So sex education was designed then to help prevent the spread of syphilis, is one of the reasons why they have sex education. In addition to the fact that they want to kind of demystify Catholic Church teachings. So that's going on through the 1930s and early 1940s. Any questions? Yes.
The previous image looks like they've taken the Virgin Mary and the Christ and co-opted it.
Yes.
From European medieval art.
Yes, it really does. Yeah, Lisa.
In talking about this I know your focus is on women, but you've mentioned a few times that this is kind of, they're trying to look at both sides. In terms of what you were just talking about with syphilis, for instance, what would be the gender differences in how they approach that sex education? Or was it not gender oriented at best, as just sort of family information?
That's a really good question. I think that they would have separated boys from girls when talking about it, but I think the information was fairly standard. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. That's a great point, Elsa. I'm going to circle back around to that as well. So the other major discourse surrounding motherhood in Mexico was that of women being angels of the home, mothers being guardian angels of the home specifically. And this is a fairly standard understanding of what motherhood means in places like the United States and Europe from the 19th century on, right? It's kind of a version of Republican motherhood, kind of a version of sentimental motherhood. So if you understand this sort of idea of mothers being pure, mothers being in charge, really being the only people that can raise children appropriately because women are naturally, biologically designed to raise children. Republican motherhood talks about raising good citizens, that's the woman's job in society. Sentimental motherhood is much the same, although it has a lot more sort of baggage attached to it. In Mexico, you have the same idea. You have a lot of people who believe that women are guardian angels of the home, and this in Mexico is very much tied to Catholicism and tied to the idea that these guardian angels in part derive their power because they are religious and because they're teaching their children to be good Catholics. the turn of the century, right before the Revolution, we have basically in the 1870s a shift globally for Catholics as a result of the papal encyclical Rerum Novarum. Rerum Novarum was an encyclical that was a reaction to sort of this widespread, quote unquote, threat of Marxism, threat of anarchism, and it was designed to give Catholics an alternative to these ideologies that the Catholic Church found so disturbing. And so what Rerum Novarum argued was that everybody has a place in society. We all have our appropriate space. We should maintain and stay in our places. But the poor are quite unfortunate, and therefore one of the things that people who are more affluent should do is help to mitigate the most egregious effects of industrialization through charity. So this is really kind of an update of typical Catholic charity thinking. So social Catholicism becomes very, very important in Mexico at the turn of the last century. And women become very, very active in social Catholicism. In particular, there's a group called the Unión de Damas Católicas, which is the Union of Catholic Ladies. And they work with the poor. They create different programs. They have, they create these homes called Casa Amiga de la Obrera, which is friend of the worker homes, where women can go and like have daycare centers and leave their children and get food and all sorts of things. The Unión de Damas Católicas continues to be in existence through the Cristero Rebellion. So this is a major Catholic charity for women, and women, I would argue, are able to perform citizenship in many ways through their charitable work. So they gain power within their families and within society because they are able to give to the poor in particular ways. Part of the Cristero Rebellion settlement, actually the Pope gets involved in this settlement. And the Pope and the Mexican government agree to end the violence. And the Catholic Church in Mexico agrees to pull back politically. But in exchange, they're going to get civic organizations that they can continue their social Catholic ministries through. So they create Acción Católica, which is Catholic Action, and there are 4 branches of Acción Católica. There's one for men, one for married women or older women, one for younger women, and one for younger men. So this comes out in 1929 into 1930. At the same time, sort of on a separately, this has nothing really to do with Mexico, the Pope issues another encyclical called Casti Connubii. And so you know you're a nerd when you have a favorite papal encyclical. So this is my favorite papal encyclical. So let me just read you a little bit about Casti Connubii. On December 31st, 1930, Pope Pius XI released the papal encyclical Casti Connubii. It was, and I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, unless I can tell me. Okay. It was released to address what the Pope saw, or the Church saw, as new threats to marriage, specifically birth control and abortion. So there's a lot of anxiety about Margaret Sanger in particular. Like if you read through this stuff, like they're super upset about birth control and Margaret Sanger. They're also very upset with what they see as increasing rates of abortion. And they tie this to the eugenics happening in the United States and Germany. And so they're very anxious about this. So the encyclical also addressed quote unquote conjugal unity, exploring the meaning of Christian marriage. The encyclical emphasized that marriage's purpose was producing offspring, growing in conjugal faith, and benefiting from the sacrament. The encyclical first explored the nature of marriage, followed by a discussion of its advantages for individuals and societies, erroneous but common beliefs about marriage, threats to pure marriage, and then finally how to combat these threats. According to the encyclical, the greatest threats to marriage were that of, again, the growing popularity of contraception and abortion. According to Pope Pius XI, the true purpose of Christian marriage placed significant emphasis on the proper use of sexuality within marriage, which was procreation, and secondarily, bringing a married couple closer together emotionally. And so this is actually a really big shift in the way the Catholic Church is approaching sex within marriage. Forever, they've always said, well, the only reason for married couples to have sex is to procreate. And with Casti Connubii, the Pope is basically saying, well, married couples can have sex just to feel closer together, like to reinforce the marriage. So I think that this is a pretty big deal in the way that the Pope is addressing sexuality. Casti Connubii also emphasized the importance of mutual respect and dignity for the ultimate companionship between partners and an increased closeness to God. So again, married couples are supposed to be partners. This is also, I would argue, sort of an attack on unfettered patriarchy, right? Like, men also have to be contributing to these families and these partnerships. Finally, the sacrament of matrimony was reiterated as a bond that binds two people by the power of God, and as such cannot be destroyed by the man-made division of divorce. So it was also addressing what the church saw as increasing divorce rates globally. So Pope Pius also used this document to voice the church's resistance to what the church saw as the new social values taking hold. With divorce rates increasing, Casti Connubii warned that the new attitudes would jeopardize the benefits and purposes of marriage. According to historian Catherine Bryn-Damour, quote, while this document is very vocal about the challenges facing Christians seeking a holy union, it is also vocal about solutions. In addition to suggesting strict adherence to church doctrines on the matter of marriage, Pope Pius XI recommended that governments opt to assist struggling families with the necessary money for raising families, as opposed to funding abortion providers or enacting forced sterilization policies. So the church is now stepping in to basically push back against government's eugenic policies by saying charity can be a way to give money to the poor so that the poor don't feel forced to have an abortion or use birth control. So in 1940, 10 years after this, and after 6 years of socialist education, the Unión Femenina Católica Mexicana, or this is the Married Women's Group, has its 5th National Assembly, and it's dedicated to the subject of Christian marriage and Casti Connubii. So its first topic, this is a really interesting, I found a folder of, it's a conference, so people are getting up and giving talks like I am, and they're all transcribed, so I got to go through the transcriptions. So the first speech was on the forgotten greatness of the sacrament of Christian marriage, which emphasized that marriage was for children, so to have children, to raise children, and the mutual help of spouses. And then it goes on to say the UFCM must combat with practical means the errors against the sanctity and purity of Christian marriage, mainly those that are committed alleging economic pretext, therapeutic indications, eugenics, etc. So again, this speaker is pushing back against this idea of eugenics as being an appropriate way to structure, in particular, Mexican families or to shape Mexican families. But it's really Christian marriage and particular ways that Christian marriages are strong that should shape and form the family. And I just want to point out, be up there, the mutual help of the spouses. So that'll be important in a minute. Another quote, while it is true that the superficiality of the environment, the influence of foreign customs, immoderate luxury, fashionable vanities, and even the struggle for life itself, which is more intense every day, have contributed greatly to causing family disorders, these are strange causes that would not penetrate into the intimacy of the home if it rested on the solid foundations it should have. Irreligion, selfishness, lack of charity, and compliance with the reciprocal duties that the family demands is what leads in large steps to the decline of our nation. So, Catholics at this time are really upset with US consumer culture that's invading. They're really upset with the movies. They see Hollywood as being this corrupting influence. They also see radio as being really problematic. And they keep using that word, which is really fascinating for a gender historian, of things penetrating the family. They talk about radio being particularly dangerous because it's in the home and it's penetrating the home. But again, you can see this idea of reciprocal duties, right? That men and women have to work together to raise these families in order to be Christian and then to improve the nation. Some other quotes: the real cause of family disorders is a lack of religion. Not only is the woman responsible for family disorders, but that the man, to a large extent, contributes to her bad behavior. So men, you don't have control over your wife, and that's your fault. And so men also have to take responsibility for their wives' bad behavior. And finally, they request that the men's organizations of Catholic Action carry out activities in the sense that men acquire a solid religious and family education that leads them to practice their duties towards God, and towards their families. So again, we see this discourse over and over again that's really about reforming, I would argue, the way men work within their families. So no longer are men able, or they're arguing, right, that men shouldn't be able to do whatever they want, that men shouldn't have unlimited freedom, and that men should be able to ignore their families with no repercussions. They're arguing that for Mexico to progress and to modernize, you need to have these Catholic Christian families as the bedrock. And in order for these families to prosper, men have to do their part. So men also have to help in child rearing. Men also have to obviously support their families, but they need to play a central role in the construction of families. So, what does all of this mean? I've gone through, 40 minutes of discussion actually to problematize a very tiny historiographical debate, but one that I think is really important. There has always been an understanding in Mexican history that the church and the state were at odds. Until, again, 1940, when President Avila Camacho says, "I am a believer," and all of a sudden, everything is hunky-dory. And nobody really questions that. Like, why would the president say this one line in a speech and have the entire militant Catholic, all these militant Catholic groups, this Acción Católica, all of these different groups be like, "Oh, well, great, awesome, the president's a Catholic, so we can settle our differences with the state." So what I would argue is if you look into the way groups that supposedly were at polar opposite ends of understanding, polar opposite worldviews, let's say, how much they actually had in common, and we can begin to see why it was so easy in the 1940s to move forward with this sort of rapprochement. So in my first book, I talk a lot about how the programs that the Ministry of Public Welfare and the Ministry of Public Education set up bore a striking resemblance to programs that the Damas created, the Catholic groups created at the turn of the century before the Revolution. So for example, the Damas created the Casa Amiga de la Obrera, the Friend of the Working Woman. In the 1930s, you see what's Beneficencia Pública until 1937. But you see federal and municipal governments in Mexico City also creating Friend of the Working Women houses. So they're literally copying these Catholic welfare or assistance programs and just slapping a secular name on them. So that's one thing. I think that there isn't a lot of difference between what reformers in the 1930s and 40s are doing. There's not a lot of difference between them and what Catholics did at the turn of the century. This is all done in the 30s and 40s under the guise of eugenics and also this idea of modernizing the patriarchy, right? So social workers, teachers are arguing that these men need to be reined in, that they need to stop, as I said, gambling and going to cockfights and drinking too much and going to prostitutes, and they need to settle down and get married and raise their children. And if men will do that, then we can have these strong Mexican families. Which really sounds familiar to what these women, Catholic women, are arguing in their assemblea, right? That men need to settle down, they need to come back into their families, and they need to form partnerships with their wives in order to have these good Christian families. Both see the family as a bedrock of the nation. They both believe that without strong families, Mexico cannot modernize. And so I would argue that they have far more in common than they do different, which is not the way historiography sees this church-state conflict in Mexico. And I think the importance of using gender as a category of analysis is that it allows us to see how power works in society. So how do women perform citizenship? How does the state attempt to co-opt women? How does the Catholic Church attempt to co-opt women as well? And how do women understand their place in these societies? I think really helps us reflect on these larger trends and helps us understand how these conflicts that resolve very, very quickly, why they are able to be resolved so quickly, which is an important point to make in Mexican history. So I will stop there.